Welcome, my name is Tony Mason. I'm a community artist, storyteller and social historian. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Carlisle State Management Scheme. It's an interesting tale, not that well known outside of Carlisle and the districts that it served. And it was brought in by Her Majesty's government in 1916. What is surprising about the Carlisle social experiment, as it was called, was that it lasted up until May 1973. And we have to ask why this was brought in at this time. We were well into the second year of the First World War. There was a massive need by Her Majesty's government for ordnance, for shells and bullets, and it was decided early in 1916 to build the world's largest ordnance factory, and that would be 6 miles up the road on the border with Gretna. What you must understand is in those days, all right, we had the early onset of planes and trains and automobiles. There weren't that many cranes, there weren't that many aids to construction. A lot of things were still made dug by hand with navvies. What we also had in 1916 was full employment in Great Britain. If you weren't fighting the Kaiser for Her Majesty's government on land, sea or air, then you were actually working on the land. Or in a shop, or for some type of war effort. Consequently, the government needed men, and most of the men they needed were navvies, and a large proportion of them came from Ireland. Estimates reckon about 12,000 men, young men, came over to, on very good money, as we'll find out, to build the largest munition factory in the world at that time. They also brought 4,000 others, hangers-on, people, parents, sisters, and everything that would follow along with a small shanty town, as you would expect. So we're looking at about 16,000 people coming in and around Carlisle. Carlisle's population in 1911 was about 50,000, which is about half of what it is today. And if you went back to 1850, it was only about 12,500. So there was a massive, massive influx of people coming in. This was a great social experiment. It was one of 3 schemes in Britain. And it wasn't the first scheme, nor was it the second scheme. It was the third scheme. The first scheme was in Enfield in London. And this was brought in because the Enfield rifle was made in these factories. The second scheme was brought in was in Cromarty Docks in Scotland. Both times was brought in due, should I say, to excessive drinking by the factory workers. So the state had already intervened by the time April, May, June, July of 1916 occurred, and they intervened in Carlisle in a big, big way. We must understand also what else was going on. In 1916, you had the beginnings of the Easter Rising in Ireland. You also had the Battle of the Somme, which didn't go on for one day or 1 week, it went on for months. So the government had and needed to act. In fact, I'll quote you something from Lloyd George at the time, and he said, "We are fighting Germany, Austria and drink. And so as far as I can see, the greatest of these deadly foes is drink." So this wasn't, we may laugh and scoff a bit today about why it was set up, but the government were deadly earnest in what they were going to do in and around the largest munitions factory in the world. It's as simple as that. It was social engineering. People were going to be regulated in ways they'd never been regulated before. We had never had licensing laws. Anybody could turn their home into a public house. You could brew your own beer, make your own spirits. You didn't have to serve food, and as I've discovered, you didn't even have to provide toilets. You could provide outside toilets for men and women. Two of the pubs that were closed down didn't even have those facilities. So, what happened was, by October 1916, 339 public houses and 5 breweries within 500 square miles had been nationalised by Her Majesty's government. You've got 12,000 workers. These workers, the wages that they were being paid was danger money and also money to get the job done. Unfortunately, it seemed as though that they were only being able to work 3 days out of 7, because the other 4 days they were so incapable they weren't working. Older people I've spoken to have told me that their father and uncles remember cycling through Carlisle and seeing people prostrate in the street. Oh, and this is on the morning when they were going to work. There was a number of convictions. Apparently, in the whole year of 1916, there were close to 1,000 convictions for drunken disorderly. Prior to this, it had been about 50. They actually had to call out some of the armed forces from the castle because the police force could just not cope with what was going on. These workers were paid £20 a week. Now that's quite a lot of money for 1916. When you compare that, you could buy a house in Carlisle at that time for 40 quid a week. You could buy a house for £40. These guys were getting paid £20 a week. By the time they'd paid £1 for their digs, that left an awful lot of money and time. And basically, if you had 5 navvies living in your home and you were getting good money for it, you didn't really want to see them. You wanted them out. You only wanted them in to go to bed. You didn't want them hanging around the house, but you were making good money from this, as were the publicans in Carlisle. It was almost probably a bit like the gold rush, the Yukon would have been in the United States of America. There's a tale of the Bounstead's bar near the station. Before he opened his door, he would pull 300 pints and 300 whiskies and have them on the tables, waiting for the workers coming back. I put it to you that if you've worked a 12-hour day with very little to eat and you're doing excessive manual labour, you would like to get in there. And that's what was happening in those days. Prior to the state management scheme, you could buy as much drink as you like, sit at the table, and you couldn't be asked to leave until there was no drink, until you had no more drink left in front of you. So in other words, if you had 10 pints, you could sit there all night. And many frequently did, and it was a real problem. There'd been no previous control over the code of drinking. So the government cracked down. They sent inspectors out to each hostelry. They examined the state of the public houses, how many public houses were in certain areas. For example, Stannick's had 4 taverns. It still has 2 today. Actually, it has 3 now. We have the Crown, the Crown and Thistle, and the Spiral and Fly. which actually replaces one of the original closed down state management hostelries. So there were 4 pubs in very close proximity on Stanning's Bank. Consequently, only one of them had any decent facilities, and one of them had a very bad reputation. So the government closed 2 of them down. They agreed compensation. People were given very good compensation to give up their livelihood and move on. At this point, I'm going to show you an image of a pub which is no longer around. This is the Drove-In in Stanwix, and it's now a little white cottage on the right hand side as you come over the brow of the hill from Carlisle. And the interesting story here is, and my personal testimony is, that the lady in the photograph there and the gentleman are, for all intents and purposes, are my great grandparents. They ran the Drove-In. The story goes that Mary Noble, who was Mary Johnson, was the only daughter of John Johnson, who ran Black Dyke Farm, and she fell in love and married the groom, Joe Noble. And as a wedding gift to his only daughter, he gave the couple a small holding. Fortunately, Joe Noble drank and drank the small holding dry in the pubs and taverns of Carlisle. Old man Johnson, according to family law, which my grandmother told me, the couple were given another small holding, but on the understanding that if he did this again, then that would be it. Old man Johnson would wash his hands. And you guess what happened? He did the same again, and basically they ended up Mary Noble running this pub when this photograph was taken in 1902. She was the boss. She was on the name over the door. You look back in the books of Carlisle, you'll find that the pub was named in her name, not his, because he couldn't be trusted. They were still there when the pub was shut by the state management inspectors in 1916. And like a lot of places, they had to move on and find new work. So that's my personal interest round to the Carlisle state management scheme. The head office for this scheme, and they needed one because the pub landlord or landlady who was in the scheme was a civil servant, which meant that he had to sign the Official Secrets Act as well. This carried on all the way up to 1973. The head office of the state management scheme is it's where Bookends is now in Carlisle, near and opposite Tullie House. That's where the wages were done, that's where the records were kept, that's where all the administration was taken from. One of the things that the government decided it needed to do was to feed the populace. If people had food inside them, then they were less likely to become incoherent and unstable with drink. So they looked upon opening up vast food taverns to accommodate the workers and the people of Carlisle. The first one was the Gretna Tavern, and that is now where the old, well, it's not the old, but where the TSB Bank building is or was on Lowther Street. To give you an example of what it included, you could have a 100-seater restaurant. There was a balcony for a small orchestra. The bar could seat 300 people. There was a post office, there was a cinema, and there was a dance hall. So that was one of the new ways of actually making sure the populace didn't get out of hand. The other way, and one of the most famous ways, was no treating. If I was in a pub in Carlisle before 1973 and I wanted to buy my friend a drink, it was illegal. You couldn't buy another person a drink. You could only buy your own. You weren't, the landlords were actively encouraged not to sell alcohol. They were actively encouraged to actually sell anything but, and were actually paid on that basis as well. So it was more of a community social experiment initially to assist the war effort. But as we'll see, whilst the one in London at Enfield and the one up in Scotland at Cromarty were closed down more or less straight after hostilities ended in 1918, this was not the case in Carlisle. We have to ask, why did the government not close down the state management scheme earlier? And it's come to light that it was very, very profitable. It was one of the few government departments over these years that actually made a profit. Two figures off the top of my head. In 1933, it made a profit of £60,000, which is a fair amount of money. When you add inflation on, that works at just over £4 million in today's money. That was just in 1 year. Even in the 60s, between 1960 and 1965, it made over £1 million worth of profit in those years. Now, the government didn't want to close it down because it was making money for them. One of the reasons why it finally came to its conclusion was the fact that a lot of the private brewers, Scottish and Newcastle, Bass Charrington, Tetley's, Greenall and Whitley, all these types of breweries, actually lobbied the government and said, "You're running a state-controlled monopoly here. It's not fair. The people of Carlisle deserve a choice." All the pubs in Carlisle were the same. The decor was the same. The beer was the same. The prices were the same. I'm going to show you the Carlisle and District State Management Scheme public bar price list for December 1968. And you can see there, that would have been prevalent in every club, every pub, every dance hall within the limits of Carlisle. So basically, there was competition wasn't recognised. Nobody wanted any competition. It worked as an experiment. It was very successful for over 57 years. And there are still quite a few people around today who remember it and would wish it to come back. The best example is probably the Magpie in Botcherby. Inside, it is fantastic. There is no jukebox, there is no television, there is no bandit. They have two fantastic open fires. It's pretty much as it was when the architect Harry Redfern rebuilt it in the 30s. It's one of the few surviving state management pubs with the bowling green attached, which is now back and working. A lot of the existing Harry Redfern pubs have now changed so dramatically you would never know. So pay a visit, have a look at it, because it really does give you the idea of what it was like to be in the state management scheme at the time. The brewery, of course, is now owned by Impact, I believe, and that that was still here in 1987 when I visited it, and they were brewing Old Peculiar then, I think. But that hasn't worked since 1990, so there's no brewery in Carlisle now, apart from a few small craft breweries which are springing up all over the place. The last pub that the state management actually opened and commissioned was the Reaver in Morton, I believe, and this was in 1971. And it was a modern community pub which had everything to attract people in. Sadly, it's no longer there. I think it was pulled down a few years ago now, so that even that hasn't survived. What is interesting is, I was listening to the radio the other day, and Nicky Campbell was on, and he was talking about how the government had never had the responsibility of telling pub landlords not to sell alcohol, etc., etc. And this was in respect of the second pandemic lockdown in Great Britain due to COVID-19 restrictions. And I nearly got in touch with Nicky Campbell and said, hang on a minute, what about the Carlisle State Management Scheme? Even if you talk to people from the Campaign for Real Ale in other parts of the country, they don't seem to have heard of the Carlisle and District State Management Scheme. It was unique, and who knows that it may well come back again if governments decide they need to socially experiment with their populace like they currently do in pandemics. Hi, I thought I would just show a few items of the currency that appeared in the timescale that we're talking about, more or less. The pounds, shillings and pence currency, which had been in Britain since Saxon, Norman times even, was replaced by the decimalisation in 1971. So you've got the prices of the draft ale, for example, here, which is 1 and 7. You've got the prices of the brandy, which is 3 shillings, for example. You've got the cost of some Mackinson, which is 1 and 10. You've got liqueurs, wines. So this is all in old money. This is when there were 240 pennies to the pound. And what you've got here is a 10 shilling note or a 10 bob note, and that in today's modern equivalent with inflation is worth close to £12. So that's the buying power of a 10 bob note from 1952 to 2020. The 10 shilling note was replaced by the 50 pence piece. Yeah. And what else you have here? You have Gretna bits. That's the English version there, and there's the Scottish version with the thistles on. So that was 3 pennies. Then you have sixpence, which was half a shilling, which was 2.5 pence in the equivalent of decimalisation. You also have penny farthing, which had the bird image of the wren on the back. These went out of circulation very close after the first, and well, not the First World War, the Second World War. Half pennies, 2 bob, 2 shillings, and 5 shillings. And these were equivalent of 5 pence and 10 pence. And for the older viewer, these were the silver threepences which used to go into the Christmas puddings, which I know my grandmother used to put them in, but you had to be very careful when you were eating them. Like you didn't actually find one. So, to get an ale of 1 and 7, you would have one of those, that's 1 shilling, and 7 of those, or any other equivalent. You could have one of those and one of those and a halfpenny, which would get you there. A lot different to what we use now, when the decimalisation was a lot simpler. Obviously, we don't even have pound notes now, never mind 10 bob notes. So that was the currency used, as we can see down here, from 1968 at the public bar prices. What you'll find is, if I turn this over, there were different prices, different rooms. This is 1 and 8 for the same beer, but obviously the quality of the accommodation is slightly better in this room than it was in the public bar. But women were actively disencouraged from going into public bars. Allowed in the lounge or the smoking room, but obviously you paid a little bit more. Here we have Carlisle Old Brewery Double Extra Stout, and you might be wondering, why did they use ceramic and clay bottles? Well, it was a lot cheaper than actually using glass. Glass was very expensive, so these were throwaways, disposables if you like, and one of the interesting things about Carlisle is Bitts Park. Bitts Park was originally a potter's park where everybody and potters got their clay for actually making pots such as this. And it was an easy way of transporting ales, wines and spirits rather than using glass, as I've said. But Bitts Park was interesting because when the council decided to turn it into a recreational park for the people of Carlisle, they put all the bits of the little potters' fields together and imaginatively called it Bitts Park.